The marble steps of the Palatine Hill grew slick with blood in the dying light of January. In the shadows beneath the marble columns, where torchlight once danced across gold and ivory, senators pressed themselves against cold stone walls. Their hands trembled, not from the winter wind that swept across Rome's 7 hills, but from what they had witnessed within these sacred chambers. The emperor had turned his palace into a literal brothel, transforming the very seat of Roman power into something that would make even the gods turn their faces away. The man they called Caesar had taken the throne that Augustus built and made it a stage for horrors that no republic had ever known. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, but history would remember him only as Caligula, and the palace walls still echoed with the screams of what he had done. The purple had never felt heavier on any shoulders. When Gaius ascended to the throne in March of 37 AD, Rome exhaled. Tiberius was dead, the paranoid, bitter emperor who had ruled from his island fortress of Capri, sending death sentences by messenger while the capital rotted in fear. The people lined the streets from the Campus Martius to the Palatine, throwing flower petals and shouting the name they had given the young prince as a child. Caligula, Little Boots, for the miniature soldier's sandals he wore in the Germanic camps where his father Germanicus had been beloved. The palace that welcomed him was Augustus's masterpiece, a sprawling complex of marble halls and private gardens that crowned the Palatine Hill like a jewelled crown. Frescoed walls depicted the triumphs of Rome's greatest generals. Silver fountains caught Mediterranean sunlight and cast it in dancing patterns across floors of polished onyx. The very air seemed perfumed with power, heavy with the incense burned before the household gods and the lingering fragrance of roses from the imperial gardens. In those first months, even the senators smiled. Gaius freed political prisoners, recalled exiles, and distributed bonuses to the Praetorian Guard with the easy generosity of youth. He held gladiatorial games that made the crowd roar with approval. At 24, he possessed the golden beauty of his bloodline, the sharp features of the Iuli softened by his mother Agrippina's patrician elegance. When he walked through the palace corridors, his toga praetexta trailing behind him, even the marble statues of his ancestors seemed to nod in approval. The palace slaves moved through their routines with quiet efficiency. They swept the floors where emperors had walked, arranged fresh flowers in the atrium where Augustus had once received foreign kings, and lit the oil lamps that would burn through the Roman night. The kitchens prepared delicacies that would grace tables where matters of empire were decided over wine and honeyed dormice. Everything was as it had always been, as it should always be. But in the private chambers, behind doors carved with scenes of Roman virtue, something had already begun to change. The young emperor's laughter came too quickly, his smiles lingered too long. His fingers drummed against marble surfaces with a rhythm that spoke of minds racing toward destinations that no map could chart. The fever came in October, 8 months into his reign. For days the palace physicians moved through chambers thick with the smoke of burning herbs, their faces grave as they whispered consultations in the shadows. Rome held its breath. When Caligula emerged from those fevered weeks, the servants noticed it first. The way his eyes had changed, as if he had seen something during his illness that the rest of the world was not yet ready to witness. The transformation began with whispers in the servants' quarters. They spoke in hushed voices as they changed the linens, how the emperor now demanded that his bed be made with silk sheets dyed purple, a colour once reserved for the gods themselves. How he had ordered mirrors installed on the ceiling of his private chambers, polished bronze that reflected back images the servants dared not describe. The kitchen slaves exchanged nervous glances when they carried trays of exotic delicacies to rooms where senators' wives had been summoned for private audiences that stretched deep into the night. By the second year of his reign, the palace had become something else entirely. Where once the sacred atrium had housed the wax masks of honoured ancestors, Caligula installed a brothel that operated under the imperial roof. Noble wives were forced to work as prostitutes within the very halls where their husbands debated matters of state. The emperor would sit on a throne crafted from gold and ivory, the same throne where Augustus had received barbarian kings seeking peace. An auction off the bodies of Rome's most distinguished women to the highest bidders. The marble floors that had once echoed with the measured steps of diplomats now rang with different sounds. Drunken laughter spilled from chambers where senators were compelled to witness their own humiliation. The emperor demanded that Rome's most powerful men bid against each other for the privilege of their wives' company, recording their offers on wax tablets, as if he were conducting the business of empire. In the palace gardens, where emperors had once walked in contemplation among the olive trees and roses, Caligula constructed floating bridges across ornamental pools. He would dance across these bridges wearing the breastplate of Alexander the Great, which he had ordered stolen from the conqueror's tomb in Alexandria. Sometimes he wore women's clothing, flowing stolas and jewelled diadems, as he hosted banquets where the guests were forced to worship him as a living god. The palace slaves learned to move like shadows. They cleaned blood from marble floors without question, replaced torn tapestries without comment, and burned bed linens whose stains spoke of acts that had no names in any civilized tongue. When they passed the emperor in the corridors, they pressed themselves against the walls and averted their eyes, knowing that even a glance might invite attention they could not survive. The senators came when summoned, their togas pristine white but their faces grey with the knowledge of what awaited them. They sat at banquets where their emperor served them dishes prepared with ingredients that made them retch, while he laughed and demanded they praise the flavours. They watched as he appointed his favourite horse, Incitatus, to the consulship, elevating the animal above men who had governed provinces and commanded legions. At night, when the oil lamps flickered low and the palace should have been at rest, strange sounds echoed through the corridors. The clip of hooves on marble, not from horses, but from the emperor himself, who would crawl on hands and knees through the sacred halls, braying like a donkey or neighing like his beloved stallion. Sometimes he would summon the moon goddess Diana to his bed, speaking to empty air as if immortal lovers awaited his embrace. The palace that had once been the beating heart of civilization had become a theatre of madness where Roman virtue was publicly crucified night after night. And still, the emperor smiled his beautiful smile, his golden hair catching torchlight as he transformed the seat of the world's greatest empire into his personal playground of flesh and terror. The conspiracy began with a single shared glance. On the morning of January 24th, in the year 41 AD, Cassius Chaerea's hand found the hilt of his gladius beneath his centurion's cloak. The Praetorian officer had served emperors before Caligula was born, had watched Augustus receive the surrender of Egypt, had stood guard while Tiberius signed treaties that expanded the empire to its furthest reaches. Now he walked through corridors where his own dignity had been stripped away night after night, where the emperor had mocked his high voice and forced him to repeat passwords that were deliberate insults to his manhood. The palace that morning carried the familiar sounds of preparation. Slaves swept the marble floors clean of the previous night's debauchery. Fresh flowers were arranged in the atrium where the emperor would soon appear. But beneath the routine, something electric pulsed through the air, the kind of tension that precedes thunderstorms or battles that will decide the fate of nations. Caligula emerged from his chambers wearing a purple silk tunic that shimmered like scales in the morning light. His hair was carefully arranged in the style of Apollo, golden curls framing features that still held traces of the beauty that had once made Rome love him. He walked with the measured steps of a god among mortals, completely unaware that 24 years of life were about to end in the next 24 minutes. The attack came in the underground passages beneath the theatre in corridors, too narrow for escape and too shadowed for mercy. Chaerea's blade found flesh first, sliding between ribs with the practiced precision of a soldier who had killed barbarians on Germanic battlefields. But he was not alone. Cornelius Sabinus struck next, then Marcus Vinicius, then others whose names would be whispered in senators' private chambers for generations to come. The emperor fell to his knees on stones that had been laid during the Republic, when Rome still believed in virtue and honour. Blood, imperial blood carrying the divine essence of the Julii, spread across ancient stones in patterns that no augur would ever read. The man who had proclaimed himself a god died like any mortal, his breath leaving his body in ragged gasps while shadows danced on the walls around him. Above, in the theatre, the audience waited for an emperor who would never appear. The actors held their positions on the stage, speaking lines about honour and justice while below their feet, honour and justice were being restored with blades forged in the fires of Roman workshops. Within hours, the palace transformed again. The brothel was dismantled, the mirrors were taken down, The purple silk was burned in braziers that sent dark smoke rising over the 7 hills like funeral pyres. Slaves who had learned to move like shadows now worked openly, scrubbing away the physical evidence of 4 years that Rome would struggle to understand for centuries to come. The senators emerged from their hiding places like men leaving caves after a long winter. They walked through corridors that suddenly felt larger, breathed air that no longer seemed poisoned with madness. Some wept openly, not for the dead emperor, but for the pieces of themselves they had left behind in those marble chambers, where civilization had been held hostage by one man's diseased mind. The Praetorian Guard found Claudius cowering behind a curtain in the palace, trembling like a leaf in a storm wind. They dragged him forth and proclaimed him emperor, perhaps because they needed someone, anyone, to wear the purple that was still stained with his nephew's blood. The palace remembers everything. 2,000 years have passed since that January morning when Roman steel ended Caligula's reign, yet the marble stones of the Palatine Hill hold their secrets like closed fists. Archaeologists with their careful brushes and measuring tools uncover fragments, a piece of purple-dyed silk, a bronze mirror polished to perfection, foundation stones of rooms whose original purpose they can only guess at. They catalogue their findings in sterile academic language, but the stones themselves remain silent about the screams that once echoed between their walls. The question that haunts every serious historian who walks those ruins is not whether Caligula was mad. The evidence of his final years speaks too clearly for doubt. The question is darker, more troubling, more human. How does a golden child become a monster? The boy who charmed legions in Germania bore no resemblance to the emperor who turned senators' wives into prostitutes. The young man who freed political prisoners and distributed gold to the people vanished so completely that he might have been a different person entirely. Something happened in those fevered weeks of October, something that physicians of the 1st century could not name, and doctors of the 21st century can only theorize about. Brain trauma, temporal lobe epilepsy, encephalitis, bipolar disorder, narcissistic personality disorder with psychotic features. The medical terminology changes with each generation of scholars, but the mystery only deepens. Was Caligula born with the seeds of madness already planted in his mind, waiting for the right conditions to bloom into horror? Or did absolute power, given to a mind too young to contain it, simply strip away the civilized veneer that keeps most monsters hidden? The palace slaves who witnessed his transformation took their knowledge to unmarked graves. The senators who survived spoke only in whispers, and their whispers have been lost to time. Even Suetonius, writing decades later, could only record what others told him, third-hand accounts of events so extreme that they challenged the boundaries of belief. Perhaps the most chilling possibility is that Caligula was not an aberration, but a revelation, a glimpse of what lurks beneath the surface of any human soul when all restraints are removed. The palace on the Palatine Hill, with its marble columns and golden statues, was built to celebrate the triumph of civilization over chaos. But for 4 years, chaos wore imperial purple and sat upon the throne of the known world. The tourists who visit the ruins today see only broken walls and scattered stones. They cannot see the shadows that still dance in corners where torchlight once flickered, cannot hear the echoes of laughter that was never quite human. They take photographs and buy postcards, never knowing that they walk through chambers where the very concept of human dignity was murdered and reborn, night after night, in an endless cycle of degradation and renewal. The palace remembers. And in its silence, it poses the question that no emperor, no senator, no historian has ever been able to answer. When power becomes absolute, does it corrupt absolutely? Or does it simply reveal what was always there, waiting in the darkness of the human heart,